application of the principle of equal pay for equal work or work of equal value between men and women. I'd also like to welcome the Commissioner. Welcome to our session. I'd like to begin by giving the floor to our colleague Kira Maria Peter Hansen. You have the floor as the rapporteur. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Dear Commissioner, dear Council and dear colleagues, today we are here voting on a historical and essential piece of legislation. We are here because we stand against pay discrimination, we stand against power abuses, and because equal pay for equal work should not only be a founding principle in our treaties, but also a fact on the ground. We are here because we care. We want to make a change. We want to push for gender equality, workers' rights and social progress. We want a future where there's inclusion and diversity. Today we are here to vote on the best known tool for closing the gender pay gap, to combat gender pay inequalities and pay discrimination. The Pay Transparency Directive is a huge achievement for gender equality, and it will help close the current persistent gender pay gap in the European Union on 14%. Pay transparency has the value of work at its centre, because employees should be valued for their work, regardless of their gender. With this vote, we abolish pay secrecy contract, we strengthen workers' rights and workers' individual right to information, and we ask employers to report and to fix their pay gaps. Furthermore, we ensure that all employers have pay structures in place, ensuring that the treaty-based concept of equal pay for equal work is actually enforced. With this vote, we empower workers and we strengthen the role of social partners. This vote also marks the first time in history that our non-binary friends are recognised in legislation, and the first time that we take into account intersectional discrimination as an aggravating factor. And this is a historical moment, not only because having these tools and mechanisms are a huge achievement, but also because this sends a message to the world. It shows that this is what legislation can look like when you have two young feminists leading the policies. and for that, I would like to deeply thank my colleague Samira for the hard work and incredible cooperation in the past 2 years. You're truly an inspiring politician, and it's been amazing working alongside you and your team. And on behalf of Samira and I would also like to give a special thanks to all the shadow rapporteurs and all the teams for your constant fight for gender equality. And I would like to thank the Commission as well for putting forward this legislation and supporting us in getting it over the finish line. Lastly, a special thanks should go to the Czech presidency. Without you and without this presidency, we would not have been able to vote on this important file today. And I cannot fully express my gratitude towards the Czech presidency, but I would like to underline that I'm extremely grateful that your presidency and your team chose to take on this file and really walk the extra mile to make this a reality. And coming from Denmark, it's also very nice to see that it is once again proven that smaller countries can have a huge impact on European lawmaking. Lastly, I would also like to thank our amazing teams, Asta, Julia, Claire, Hoba, Mirte and Blanca, and the contribution and expertise of NGOs and social partners that participated and worked on this file. Your work was and is extremely essential and valuable. With today's vote, we will be one step closer in ensuring that there are no more glass ceilings and no more pay discrimination. Today, we give more rights for workers and we ensure the concept of equal pay for equal work. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to give the floor to the co-rapporteur, Samira Rafaela.
Thank you very much, and good morning, dear colleagues. Good morning, Commissioner.
Today we will make history. I am incredibly proud to stand in this house and to say to all women in Europe, we are here for you. In fact, we can say this to all workers in Europe. This directive says you deserve to be treated equally and you deserve to be paid fairly, regardless of your gender, your background or your physical characteristics. With this directive, we have secured the right to information in Europe for all our citizens, and we will finally have the binding legislation we need to tackle pay discrimination in all our member states. If we had left it up to the markets, the gender pay gap would only correct itself by 2086. How could we justify this to women? How could we explain this to ourselves? We cannot. And for far too long, the economy has been organized with men in mind. Women were not the norm, and you can see this in the representation of women in leadership positions, in the pay gap, in the pension gap. There is a structural problem here, and we can't just smash the glass ceiling. We need to rebuild the entire house. And today, we are doing exactly that. Deze wet, loontransparantie, geeft alle vrouwen in Europa de handvatten om te achterhalen of...
Women in Europe need to be paid in the same manner. It should not be a situation where you find that a man who is receiving more pay for a similar post, for the same post. This is a legal framework to fight against the pay gap in a clear and relentless manner, and we will achieve this paradigm shift, and we will achieve equality in the workplace. Women who are not paid the same level by the businesses, these businesses will not move forward. Businesses need to prove that there has been no pay discrimination. The burden of proof has been put on businesses now, and I'm extremely proud of the fact that we have this modern European legislation. For the first time, non-binary people are explicitly quoted, and we also recognise intersectional discrimination. And case law will take it into account as a serious factor in pay discrimination. It was a very important point for me, and I'm here in politics to change the rules, and this is a rule that we have changed. We are in politics to ensure that emancipation is a reality. I know there are those in this chamber who will vote against the directive. I know they will hide behind certain words as administrative burden. The reality is that women in Europe are looking at us now, and they will remember this vote, and they will remember that you've put the interests of business before the interests of women. So you need to take that into account. I'm extremely proud of my colleague Kira, who have been leading these negotiations with. Thank you very much for your support. Together we have shown that this inclusive modern legislation.
Claire, Julia, Meerte, Asta, Laura and Hobba. And I thank our excellent negotiation team from all political groups, because today we will make history together. And I am glad that we could constructively work together with the French presidency, with the Czech presidency, with the Commission. We have showed that if we want to reach true equality for all people living in Europe, that we need to work together. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to give the floor for the European Commission, the Commissioner Helen Darley, please.
Thank you, President. Honourable members, good morning. Today's adoption of the Pay Transparency Directive is a significant step towards addressing the gender pay gap in the European Union and increasing women's economic and financial independence. Equal pay between women and men for equal work or work of equal value is a right enshrined in the treaty and contributes towards the fundamental principle of gender equality in the European Union. Despite the EU's right and our efforts, the gender pay gap has for decades remained a persistent problem, with women in the EU earning an average of 13% less than men. While the gender pay gap has many causes, a large part of it is due to pay discrimination and gender bias. We cannot allow women to be paid less for doing the same work or work of equal value as men. We cannot allow women to be discriminated against in the workplace because of our gender. We cannot continue undervaluing women's contribution on the labour market compared to men. Pay discrimination is often the result of an undervaluation of work done by women or of unconscious bias and deeply rooted gender stereotypes. They all continue to persist in our society, and because of the current lack of pay transparency, they often go unnoticed. The Pay Transparency Directive is a crucial tool in our fight for gender equality. This new legal framework will trigger a culture change in the workplace across the Union. It will require employers to provide information on average pay levels broken down by gender for all workers performing the same job or work of equal value. And this will enable workers to identify and challenge any pay discrimination based on sex. The directive will also require employers with more than 100 workers to publish information on the gender pay gap in their organisation. It will increase transparency and accountability and encourage employers to take action to close the pay gap. Having the information on pay or gender pay gaps is not enough, of course. Workers must also have the possibility to enforce their right to equal pay if they believe they are being discriminated. This is why the directive provides for stronger enforcement mechanisms. For instance, the directive will ensure that victims of pay discrimination can be represented in court by relevant associations and bodies, such as equality bodies. It will also ensure better compensation, shift the burden of proof, and set minimum standards for limitation periods. I draw your attention to a transposition period of 3 years for the entry into application of the new rules on pay transparency. During the negotiations, the Commission underlined that such longer period a deviation from a standard 2-year transposition period should not be seen as a precedent. It only aims at ensuring that employers will have non-discriminatory pay structures in place so as to ensure full application of the new rules at the time of transposition. Such Commission statement was included in the minutes of the meeting of Member States' deputy permanent representatives when the political agreement was endorsed on the 21st of December of last year. I thank the European Parliament, especially Samira, Kira and the others who you mentioned, for the continued support and determination to combat gender-based pay discrimination. Your commitment to gender equality has been invaluable in the development and negotiation of this legislation. The adoption of the Pay Transparency Directive will be a significant achievement in our fight for gender equality. It is a step towards a Europe where women in all their diversity can thrive equally. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to give the floor to the first of the political speakers. We'll have a round of political speakers. We'll begin with our colleague from the EPP, Maria Walsh, please.
Good morning, colleagues. Commissioner, what a day. Today, the gender pay gap in the EU stands at just under 13%, 12.7%, but this directive is going to change that. This pay gap remains unexplained for many and cannot be linked to the individual worker, education or working time. And we need this directive, as greater levels of pay transparency will uncover unjustified gender-based differences and empower the victims, many victims, of pay discrimination to seek redress. Our workers need the tools to compare salaries and ensure that they are paid equally for the work that they do, and this directive is that tool. With Ireland celebrating its 50th anniversary as a member of the EU, we can reflect on the leading role the EU has played in striving for gender equality. We must not forget that it was the EU law when we signed in 1973 which forced Ireland to abolish the marriage bar, an unjust piece of legislation which pushed thousands of Irish women out of the workforce based solely on their marriage status. Today, that struggle for gender equality reaches another milestone. It's time we finally deliver on the promises of equal pay, a founding principle of the European Union since the 1957 Treaty of Rome. We, as a European Parliament, must legislate for income equality and eradicate the gender pay gap once and for all. Ladies watching and sitting in the chamber, particularly those up here in the gallery, this today does not have to be an exception. It has to be the norm. In about a year's time, we will go to the polls at European level. At many Irish country, myself and many European countries will ask people to put their names forward for local elections. This is the time to see the 50% in this chamber and across the European Union. Let this not be the exception. Let this be the norm. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to give the floor for the S&D Group to the Vice President of the European Parliament, Evelyn Regner, please.
Dankeschön.
Thank you very much. We will be closing the gender pay gap. But this is a historic day because this transparency directive will change people's lives. David, Anna and Kim. Because this affects all of our lives. After many years of negotiations, we have agreement on this pay transparency directive. It's a foundation for women's rights, and it's an important step for an issue which is important for women and trade unions. I'm very proud of this very constructive team that have worked on this directive together. I'm very happy that this demand from the Social Democrats is now becoming reality. At the beginning of this Parliament, we said to the Commission President, we want and we need this directive, and now we have it here, thanks to this fantastic cooperation. So thank you, Kira and Samira. All female employees will have the opportunity to receive the pay information each year. This transparency will allow the systematic poor pay of women to be brought to an end. Not just salaries, but also company cars and other fringe benefits. Often it's these fringe benefits that makes the difference. Women will find it easier to know how much they will be earning, and they'll through protective mechanisms, they'll be able to enforce their rights. This will allow all employees to talk about their wages and salaries openly, especially with trade unions. So this brings all the secrecy to an end. Everybody should earn what they deserve. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker for Renew Group is Marie-Pierre Vedren.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. 13%. This is the pay gap between men and women across the European Union. This figure shows all of the inequalities, the difficult situations, and the European Union is going to put end to this difference. We owe our thanks to Kira and Samira and the negotiating teams. Thank you and congratulations, and specifically thank you to Sylvie Brunet, who unfortunately cannot be with us here today. Your struggle, our struggle, is something we brought to this chamber. It's a fight for equal pay. Pay gaps are no longer acceptable. This is a fight for emancipation because it's also financial independence. It's a necessity that we will guarantee. This is a fight for inclusion because when we are seeing regression of women's rights across the European Union, this directive will ensure that businesses take their responsibility to build this fight for equality between women and men. Thank you to everyone.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Katrien Lagensiepen. 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much, dear Helena, dear colleagues, dear citizens up in the audience. History is being made, we're making progress, and today we're making progress by ending discrimination. Very often it's said to women, well, you're just imagining this discrimination. How can you prove that men earn more than women? Prove it. And we're ending that today. So women with different backgrounds don't have to prove this. No, we're turning it around. The enterprise, the other side, has to prove that men and women are what they're earning. And no, I don't think this was a bad negotiation. It was just wage discrimination. It was not something imagined. It wasn't incompetence with negotiating for wages. So we're making progress. We're ending the pay gap, and we're doing that today for women in the EU.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And now for the European Conservative and Reformist Group, Margarita Lopez-Carrion.
President, Commissioner, colleagues. Once again, using the excuse of supposed equality to generate inequality, even between women. Some of you call this intersectionality. I call it injustice. This is just a slogan directive where the title has nothing to do with what you want to impose on us. You're not seeking gender equality. You want to introduce gender ideology into our laws. You want to force member states to do things. You want to dominate companies and our lives for a situation where talent will not be recognised. Meanwhile, European companies, workers and families are already treated poorly by the Green Deal. There's inflation, there's suffocating red tape. Now they also need to comply with a poor regulation which will lead to a number of disputes. For this reason, I have, on behalf of my group, introduced a motion to reject this, and I invite you to follow this, because if you're in favour of progress for men and women in the EU and not left-wing demagogy, you should be able to follow this. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to the I&D group. Christine Anderson, please.
Thank you. Das EU-Parlament mal wieder.
EU Parliament once again is making everyone fight one another, in other words, to divide and rule. And by making these demands for pay, you can now know what everyone earns. And then you're going to end up with the cases of envy and a poisoned work environment. If there are male colleagues where you could adjust the wage, if there aren't any men, then you have imaginary men in order to adjust the potential wage. And so if there isn't any wage discrimination, then you can just insist that there's a theoretical possibility of having wage discrimination in order to assert claims. So you're completely intoxicated with equality. I really have to question this. What are you thinking? Who is tying your shoes every morning?
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to give the floor to the left group, Eugenia Rodriguez Palop. You have the floor. Thank you very much, President. 70 years ago, supposedly, women achieved equality. However, the pay gap continues in the European Union. Now, as we know, opacity is part of the problem. This directive finally recognises the right to information for all workers is a major, so therefore it's a major step forward. The surprising point is it's been so difficult to get to this point. We have lacked ambition and we are still behind the curve. Part of the obligation of this directive is for information on the pay gap. Unfortunately, it leaves out 99% of European businesses because it only forces those businesses with over 100 members of staff and only in 8 years' time. And we know that for the Commission and the Council, we wouldn't be talking about 1% of European business, but it would be 0.2% of business. So we have made a step forward, but we're still very far behind the Spanish legislation, for example, where we have more progressive rules. The threshold is 50 workers with, and they also have to provide equality plans. And this hasn't created additional burden. It's created a business environment which is better. In Spain, in Europe, we have this requirement to move forward, but we still need to continue moving forward.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to give the floor to non-attached member Adam Koza.
Vitán felülálló.
Thank you very much. Our goal is to ensure that we ensure equality for men and women when it comes to salaries. However, there are mistakes in this directive because it has forced issues that are the focus of Liberals. The draft directive is not in line with the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, and I therefore will not vote in favour of this draft legislation. For years we have been working to ensure that women receive the same wages as men, and when we could actually reach that goal. But it's not about having one model for payment. No. It is absurd the way this directive is being drafted. We are legislators. Voters want us to end differences in wages between men and women, and this is what we should focus on, nothing else.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to give the floor to Sirpa Pitkainen. 2 minutes, please.
Pay discrimination is not allowed in our treaties. It is denied by the Equal Pay Directive. Somehow, after tens of years of existence in the EU, we still lack both in the equal pay for equal work, and not to talk about equal value, the 30% on salaries on women. This is not acceptable. What you do not know, you cannot act upon. And this is the reason why this Pay Transparency Directive is so important. It gives the possibilities for employers and employees to have the full picture of what is the legal grounds and basis for their salary, based on the competence, on the demandness of the work and other special qualifications, not the gender. And this gives the first possibility to really see where we stand and to take the positive actions. It's important that it is criminal to discriminate in concrete by gender. I find it extremely important that by this directive we are going to have the harmonised criteria, indicators and application systems developed by EIGE together with the Commission. This ensures the comparability between different industries, member states, public and private sectors, so we actually know where we stand. It is important that the Commission, as Parliament asks, reviews the directive within due time, so to expand its coverage, because now it is covering less than 1% of the enterprises and 50% of the workers, so that it covers all the workers and all the employers. And maybe active equality programming and eradication of these problems could be included in this review. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is from Vice President Mark Angel.
Dear President, dear Commissioner, dear colleagues, the principle of equal pay for equal work is enshrined in our treaty since 1957, and this is not an invention, as we often hear from the anti-gender ideologists from the right side, that this is an idea from feminists. This is in our treaty, and we are fighting for union of equality, and you are defending patriarchy. That's the difference. 2012, we had recommendations. The Commission came up with recommendations. Some countries followed these recommendations, and the gender pay gap closed in these countries. So this is, again, an example that often recommendations is not enough. We need legislation, and I'm happy that we get this legislation today. For the S&D Group, it was very important that this directive will work for all women, the women in small companies and in bigger companies. Unfortunately, the threshold is now companies of 100 who have to report annually, but we were able to bring it down from 250 to 100, and we were all able together to strengthen the individual rights of workers in this directive, which is very important. So this directive is now working for all the women. And remember, it was the women during COVID who brought us through tough times, the women in the supermarkets, the women in the hospitals who worked very hard and who made the whole society function. So I'm very happy also that these individual rights are very strengthened, trade union rights are strengthened also, and we have the shift of the burden of proof on pay-related issues. The burden of proof will shift from the worker to the employer. But I'm very proud also on the gender-inclusive language which we put in there. This directive works for women and men in all their diversity. We're out of this binary view, we are in a linear view. There is a diversity of men, there is a diversity of women. This has been stated by rulings from the ECJ, and therefore it's good that this is a modern legislation. Thank you very much to the two young feminist rapporteurs, Samira and Kira, and I'm proud as an old feminist, male feminist, also to have been participating in this. I want to thank also my good cooperation with Evelyn Regner in the S&D team. Our team was fantastic too. So we did great teamwork together, and we did something for the women in our European Union. Thank you very much.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to Dragos Pizladou. 1 minute, please.
Domnule președinte.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, colleagues. Often we are asked, what do you do in the European Parliament to help citizens? Every time I go back to Romania, people ask me that. What kind of positive change will you bring about in our lives? Well, a specific example is this directive for equal pay for men and women. We have been speaking for 60 years about values and principles that we are not putting into practice. Women in Romania earn less than men, and when they retire, the situation's even worse. This legislative initiative will have a direct impact on citizens' lives, especially women's lives, and it will combat discrimination. Everyone will earn the same for equal work, and this directive will improve women's financial situations, but it will also have a positive impact on the whole of society. I would like to thank Samira and Kira, to all colleagues who were shadow rapporteurs on this file, and I'm very grateful that I was able to be part of that team. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to give the floor to Elżbieta Rafalska.
Panie Przewodniczący.
Chair, Madam Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen. Let me tell you about the situation of women in my country, in Poland, as regards pay gap. In Poland, the country that is being so frequently attacked in the parliament, this gap amounts to 4.5%. We rank second only to Luxembourg and Slovenia. So Poland is very high up, is ranking very high on this list. As regards the public sector, we have a negative pay gap of 0.6%, whereas in the private sector, we rank at the European average, which is 13%. As regards women aged 55 to 64, we have a positive difference favoring women, 6%. In construction industry, 9%, and transport and warehousing is also mainly staffed with women. I'm saying this in order to underscore the fact that we do have member states which have been driving towards gender equality prior to any directives in this respect. I do believe that we can do better, and I believe that this directive will be helpful indeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a blue card. Sorry, colleague. You have a blue card. I wonder if you want to reply. You got a blue card from Margarida Marques from the S&D Group. Do you want to reply?
Muito obrigada, Presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to ask a question, but firstly, I'd like to thank all those colleagues who have been involved in this directive, this proposal that we're discussing today. I'd also like to thank the Commissioner for her work on this. The path to get to here, that has allowed us to get to here, is linked to the fight of feminists. They've been trying to reduce the pay gap between women and men. What we have just heard is a situation in one country. The European Parliament does not legislate for one country, it legislates for the European Union. And the question is, dear colleague, do you feel comfortable with a 13% average pay gap across the EU?
You got a floor to reply.
Doskonale wiem.
I'm fully aware of the situation and the diversification of the pay situation of men and women in various member states. There is a huge difference between the pay gap in Luxembourg and, for instance, in the wealthy countries such as Germany, France and the Netherlands. From 0.75% up to 18 or even 22%. So hence we have this average of 13. And I understand that we wish to minimize the pay gap. But let me underscore the fact that there are some member states which have been conducting their own social policy, also in other areas, without the obligations imposed from the European Union. Based on their own national strategies. I do appreciate the work of our Parliament, but I would like to shed some light and I would like to highlight what is done in the individual member states and appreciate that. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to give the floor to Anders Vistisen for 1 minute.
We experience once and again that we look at good cases where we're going to solve problems, that we end up with this excessive bureaucracy that lays down a lot of rules and costs for companies, with the result of trying to reduce this gender gap. It's doubtful that that will achieve this. So the Parliament should be not looking at things that are best dealt with in the national member states. As a Dane, I'm very concerned to see how the EU moves into areas of social rights, of employment rights. In Denmark, we have a Danish model, which has proven to be much better than what you're proposing here, that politicians and should be not determining how you can solve these solutions. It should be up to the social partners and the workers to deciding that. So you have to, if you want to see a well-functioning system, you should look at Denmark, where you don't have this overburdened bureaucracy, but you have good agreements.
Sorry, you've got a blue card. If you want to answer, is Mr. Pislaro.
Yeah, I mean, dear colleague, you've mentioned the fact that things should be applied at national level. I have opened the statistics looking in Denmark. The pay gap in Denmark is 12.7%. Is that the way you would like things to happen in Denmark? I mean, is that a proof that you are bringing forward that the situation is perfect? If you are for, which I understand from your declaration, that you are for equal pay for equal work, then why in Denmark the situation is like that? This is exactly why we need a common action at the European level. Thank you.
Now, Mr. Anders Vistisen to respond.
The paradoxical situation is that legislation could have solved it. It would have solved it already. It's forbidden to discriminate according to gender in Denmark for many years. So if we could have solved this by having new legislation in this parliament and with more bureaucracy, why wasn't this solved 30 years ago? And one of the biggest Danish unions has determined that there is a gender pay gap, but they can't define how they want to solve it. So that's why I don't believe in this bureaucratic method of solving this. So it depends whether you're a European federalist or you believe in the European nations to solve this problem best. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to give the floor to our colleague Silvia Modig, please, for 1 minute.
Arvoisa puhemies.
President, for equal pay, for equal work, that's a self-evident question, but it's still not functioning. Still the pay gap is significant between the genders. It's been the same for over years, and therefore this proposal on pay transparency, despite its defaults and shortcomings, is a big step forward. Thanks to the Parliament directive, obligates more companies to pay transparency than the proposal by the Commission, and it is particularly nice that for the first time we mention intersectional discrimination. When you take a holistic view of a person, this is indispensable so as to tackle the root causes of the problem, because equal pay requires more than this directive. Still, women bear the biggest brunt of care work, take care of homes, and fathers are not spending that much time with the children, and media, for instance, is very gender-based. So we have to get rid of this, because there are no hobbies for boys and girls or works for women and men. There are hobbies and there are work, and therefore we have to pay the same pay for the same work, despite the gender or sex. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to give the floor to Lucas Fawless for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Commissioner, I would like to thank the rapporteurs for the great work. We are making an important step today, because if we want to talk about a Europe of equality, this pay gap between men and women cannot be accepted. Not only is it unacceptable, it is really sad and insulting for all of us that came here with the vote of the European citizens. Let's look at some data. Women in the EU are paid 13% less than men. There are huge gaps from country to country. We have 30% of women working part-time, whereas it's 8% of men. Women work more hours per week. 1/3 of them has to stop working in order to take care of the children. That and other data prove that equal work for equal pay is not a fact today in the EU. And if it's not a fact, we cannot talk about an EU of equality and equality before the law. We cannot do enough to stop this situation. So there's still a lot of things we have to do, and we have to be united. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Gabriele Bischoff.
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Commissioner Dalli. Many have said this already. This is an historic day, and this Parliament has done excellent work. And why? I believe on the right side there are a few people who said, oh no, this only creates bureaucracy. They don't have understood the life reality of women in all of their diversity. And for that reason, women in Europe looking at this debate, they see that we are looking, and I'm very happy to hear Mrs. Rafalska saying these words, that we have countries where it works. We have countries where it's important for me as someone who comes from the country where there always has been gender pay discrimination. It's good to know that it works. We can pull away the veil and look at this, pull away the secrecy, which is the reason that so many women have such a difficult path to achieve wage equality. And we have instruments for representatives of workers, for work councils. This gives us tools to remove this veil of secrecy, and we will achieve this. Thank you.
Yes, Gabrielle, you got a blue card? Okay. So, Mr. Ronca, you got the floor.
Okay, thank you. Bardzo cieszę się z Pani wypowiedzi, ale mam pytanie, dlatego że Niemcy, Niemki, politycy niemieccy dosyć często
I have a question to you, if I may. German politicians have very often said that Poles are not tolerant and that we are a little bit backward in this respect. So I would like to know what the German politicians have done in the same time. We see a very negative situation of women in Germany. You are out of the rule of law in Germany. Why are you pointing your finger at Poland, and why can you accept that you know very little about Poland and you keep criticizing Poland? So Germans are in such a poor situation.
Dear colleague, if you had listened to me, then you wouldn't have asked such a dumb question. I have to say, I praised Poland, and I said, for us, it's our hope that there are countries where it's working out, and it shows that it can happen without destroying the economy if you have equal pay for equal work. And the women in Germany, women from unions, women from different parties, from women's organizations, they're all fighting for that, and they're happy about the fact that we're achieving what they've been fighting for. And for that reason, it's a good day for women in Europe, for gender equality, and it's also a good day for Europe.
Colleagues, let me recall that there are translation facilities here in the podium, so when there is a blue card, you can hear the translation here in the podium, and in any event, you should stand up when speaking, but no problem, just to remind those rules. Now I give the floor to Chiara Genma. 1 minute.
Grazie, Presidente, Commissario.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Commissioner, once again, we are here in this chamber speaking about one of the worst discriminations which exists, pay gap between women and men. We need to insist and ensure that the principle of equal pay for equal work is applied. We need to ensure pay transparency and joint pay assessments. Moreover, it's important to underscore that European businesses with over 100 staff will have to provide information on salaries. This is something that won't be done with businesses which have less than 100 workers. There'll be no additional burden for businesses that have less than 100 members of staff. The real situation of SMEs in Italy, a vital part of the economy, will not be penalised in any way, shape or form. This is the path forward to put an end to this cancer which has been existing for far too long, poisoning the world of work.
Muito obrigada. Próximo.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Annika Brunner. 1 minute, please.
Ce rapport est à l'image de la...
This report is similar to all of the texts we vote on in the European Parliament, often laudable objectives but completely disconnected from reality. We cannot judge a text by its title, but we have to do so by looking at the whole text. What about company bosses who are struggling to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and who are affected by the current inflation crisis? What we are doing is we are adding an administrative burden to their work. You are imposing more standards on companies, publishing information and reports, and the burden of proof is on the employer. If we want to achieve pay equality for men and women, we cannot accept that our business owners be the victim of these decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next speaker is Frances Fitzgerald. You have the floor.
President, Commissioner Dalli, colleagues, I'd like to thank all the MEPs who have worked so cooperatively on this file to ensure we're at this moment in time here today. For the EPP, Maria Walsh and Sirpa Pitikanen have put in a huge amount of work, as I know everybody has. This is a fundamental principle of our democracy, equal pay for equal work. This has been one of our guiding principles in gender equality since the foundation of our union, yet we've never realised it in reality. We've been behind, but today we are on the cusp of great historical change. This legislation to finally close the gender pay gap will be a game changer. The 12.6% pay gap that still exists, not to mention the 39% pension gap, hopefully will be reduced and will be no more in the time ahead. This directive will promote gender pay transparency across Europe, meaning it is good for women, but it is also very, very good for business. There is a huge loss to our economies from the lack of gender equality, and we have to focus on this more and more. By disclosing the gender pay gap at company level, we can get to the root of the problem. We can see exactly what's going on, and already we've seen changes when you have this transparency, and they're very surprising, some of the data that's emerging, let me say, from companies you wouldn't expect to see it from. So it's very important. We have waited far too long for this. Today we are showing that we are standing for the right for women to be treated equally in Europe. Thank you.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And now I'd give the floor to Vera Tax for 1 minute, please.
Stel, je wint €300.000 in de loterij. Wat zou je ermee...
100,000 euros, you win it on the lottery. What would you do? Would you buy a car? Would you buy a house? Well, this is what you need to do. You need to work to earn that money. However, the half of us receive 300,000 as a bonus throughout our careers. This is what men earn more than women on average over a career, 12% more than women, and in Netherlands it's 14%. People say that, oh, this doesn't happen in my business, but the reality is that there are workers who want to know what people earn. They want to stop this pay gap, and then these people are sacked. This is the reality. This is a reality that we need to change. The European Union is going to do so. It's going to do so by changing the burden of proof. It's the business owner who needs to show that there is no pay discrimination in their business. In doing so, we can change the balance of power. I'd like to thank Kira and Samira for having achieved this. 3 years.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Johan Nissinen, please.
Thank you, President. These are matters that are outside of the EU competence. They are dealt with best at member state level. And I think the best possible solution is not a Brussels solution. The Transparency Directive is expensive, it's complicated, it's bureaucratic, and it completely knocks the legs out from under the Swedish model where the union and the employers negotiate. And how it's up to the hiring interview to determine the wage situation and how it should be communicated. So very few people should be determining what should be happening for enterprises throughout the entire EU. And I think this model, applying to all people, can be placed within a few small categories. This is a model that's going to work very poorly, and I don't think it belongs anywhere other than the waste paper basket.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to give the floor to our colleague Jaroslav Duda.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Thank you very much, President, Madam Commissioner. I would like to say at the long last, because quite recently, as I talked to a colleague, I had a feeling that there is no need to regulate something that is pretty obvious by implementing a directive in this respect. But as I listen to some of those voices in this hall, I see that the directive is indispensable. So I would like to congratulate the rapporteurs, and I'm happy to see that we are regulating this issue at the long last. It is a huge problem that in the 21st century we have such a strong gap in terms of remunerations between the genders. It's really very prevalent. I would also like to say that I'm very happy to see that there is this step-by-step model which is included in the draft directive, which makes us hopeful that the respective regulations will be implemented in the member states. And I also do believe that thanks to due diligence of the member states and employers, we will never again have to revisit this issue in this chamber. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Duda.
From colleague Wisniewska. Please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr. Duda, I would like to ask you a question which relates to the directive itself. You've just said that this directive will lead to a greater transparency, that women will have greater opportunities. You have been elected in Poland, and you will probably know full well that in Poland we have one of the lowest pay gaps in the European Union. We've managed without such regulations. we have very equal pay for men and women. So wouldn't you be afraid that this regulation might the President has cut the microphone.
Frau Kollegin Wisniewska.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Wisniewska, sir, you have the floor.
Pani poseł.
Thank you very much. I would like to congratulate Mrs. Rafalska on her statement. It was very good. Yeah. Madam Rafalska is in the hall. Yeah, I'm answering your question right now. So I'm quite surprised by your question, Madam Wisniewska, because I'm proud of what is happening in my country in this respect. Because indeed, we do have that. With this gender pay gap is one of the smallest in Europe. This is the result of many years of work, but I do believe the directive will be necessary. I don't know how you will vote as ECR, but I believe that we do have to adopt such regulations in this chamber. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Duda. 1 minute for Mrs. Galvez Munoz.
Gracias, Presidente, Comisario.
Thank you, Mr. President, Commissioner. Thank you to the rapporteurs, because today we've taken a significant step forward in Europe to fight pay discrimination against all women in Europe. The pay gap is around 13%, and this means the annual gap in income is around 40%. This leads to higher risk of poverty, higher risk of leaving the labour market, lower negotiating capacity, and a higher inefficiency in our labour markets. That's why this Pay Transparency Directive is a fantastic step forward. It obliges businesses with more than 100 workers to share information to allow for pay to be compared, so that we know that if work of equal value is being paid at the same level for all of those involved. It also ensures that sexist criteria cannot be used to set pay levels. If this does happen, then workers who have been discriminated can be compensated. It also has incentives to be set up to ensure people achieve these rules. We are moving towards a fairer Europe.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mrs. Roth-Negrelova.
Ďakujem veľmi pekne.
Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I consider the adoption of this directive to be historic. Finally, the EU will have legislation that will work against the pay gap between men and women. And it's very important to define what equal work means, so we can make effective comparisons, so we no longer just hear that women work less, they're weaker, and that's why they deserve less pay. I'm very happy that we have more transparency now in remuneration, and there's going to be an obligation to not just publish the amount of the salary for the positions being offered, but also a comparison with the amount between men and women. It has to be very clear to see who's really trying and who's just pretending to be equal. There are countries with anti-discrimination laws, but practice shows that these can be circumvented, and I think this directive will help us to use the existing laws more effectively. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Roth.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Roth-Negrelova. Now we've moved to catch the eye, 6 persons. And then the list is closed. Mrs. Carvalho is first.
Caro Presidente.
President, Commissioner, European women earn 13% less than men for work of the same value. This discrimination means thousands of euros difference at the end of the year. However, the consequences are not purely economic. We cannot undermine the demotivation that this leads to when women are not paid for their qualification. This directive is another step forward to put an end to gender discrimination. The European People's Party will give its full support to this. However, we know that the success of these measures will be linked to their sustainability. That's why we wanted to introduce progressive amendments for SMEs. We wanted to ensure that we can win this battle.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mr. Olekas.
President, dear colleagues, I call on you to evaluate the pay differences in rural areas where women face various challenges. The income opportunities are fewer. We should take into account the infrastructure in rural areas. On the European level, women hold farms which are 40% smaller than those of men, and when it comes to pension gap, the difference is 50%. In Lithuania, women farmers are responsible for 50% of all farms, but they receive their income is much lower. I think if we achieve equality in agricultural payments in EU, that would help us in our strive for equality. Rural areas will become a place attractive for women farmers.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Hoogeveen.
Ja, dank u voorzitter. Ik voel dat het nodig is om...
Thank you very much, President. I think it's important to perhaps counteract some of this pessimism, because in Europe women are doing very well in education, for instance. Women have overtaken men. 60% of dentists and doctors are women. 75% in child education, more than 80% in higher education. It's true that men have less training, there's more cases of school failure. So inequality is a widespread phenomenon, and we need to combat this together by improving assistance for younger people and in nurseries.
Thank you very much. 1 minute, Mrs. Pereira.
Thank you, President. Once again, we have a directive, and this is highly expected, but it doesn't move forward significantly when we fight pay disparity between men and women. At times, it can legitimize them and extend them. This is in relation to the 5% of average. So there is some disparity, is acceptable. Why is that? However, it won't be in support of the rights of women. In my country, the idea of equal pay for equal work is something that's well anchored, but it's not it's seen in reality because there is no political support for it, and we often see subcontracting as an excuse for different pay levels. In reality, this proposal undermines the position of the European Parliament and doesn't fight the Brussels neoliberalism, will not help to significantly move forward the situation of those women who are working, and above all those on low salaries.
Thank you. The next speaker is Mrs. Novak.
Thank you very much for the floor, Chair. Equal pay for equal work. This should be a given. We shouldn't even have to discuss this issue, because it has to be clear, if we are carrying out an equal work, we have to be equally paid. It is more questionable the next issue. How are we going to define work of equal value? Because unfortunately there are professions that are not equally paid. Many women, for example, are cleaners, And jobs like these are not respected enough. That is why there are enormous differences in payments between men and women. And this, of course, reflects in the old age when women have lower pensions, when more women are widows because they live longer than men. And because of it, we are also facing a huge problem. When every honest job is honestly and fairly paid, this pay should be sufficient for a decent living.
Thank you, Mrs. Novak. To conclude the discussion, Mrs. Grappini.
Doamna comisar, stimați colegi, se pare că noi astăzi
Commissioner, colleagues, we are debating something which appears to be normal. But what has surprised me has been the perspective of certain colleagues who believe that we do not need this legislation. They believe that everything is fine, everything's fine between employers and trade unions, and they would create more red tape. Well, I can say I come from the private sector, and today there is a difference between men and women when it comes to doing the same work and the pay. Democracy, so the voluntary rules are not being respected. Therefore, it's essential that we have this directive. Everybody needs to understand that there should be no pay differences. No, we're not talking about just about the situation of cleaning ladies. We need to have the same pay for the same work, and for this reason I will be voting in favour of this directive. However, it needs to be implemented in member states, and we need to monitor that to make sure that it is done.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kollegin Grapp.
Thank you, Mrs. Grappini. To conclude the discussion, we have the Commissioner and the two rapporteurs. So on behalf of the Commission, Mrs. Dalli.
Thank you, President. Honourable members, the adoption of the directive on pay transparency will benefit all workers and all businesses in Europe. Together, we need to raise awareness about this new directive to ensure that workers know their rights and that employers understand their obligations. In addition, this directive will contribute towards economic growth and competitiveness, close the gender pay, pension and employment gap in line with the Social Pillar Action Plan, value women's contribution to the labour market, and make sure that women are not left behind in the twin green and digital transition. In the current climate of post-pandemic crisis, the war against Ukraine, high energy prices and inflation, it is even more important that gender-responsive approaches are at the centre of building the future of the Union of Equality. Paying women and men equally should be part of our response. So I thank again the rapporteurs, all the MEPs who have worked for this day. I see Evelyn here, Maria, Vera, Dragos, Mark, but many, many more, of course. And also I thank the Czech presidency for having achieved a successful result, and the European Parliament for your ongoing support. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Vielen Dank, Frau Kommissarin.
Thank you, Mrs. Dalli. Mrs. Raffaella is next.
Thank you, dear colleagues, for your support and the valuable contributions. You know, I'm not going to waste any time anymore in this House to explain that we have gender inequality in Europe. I'm just not going to do that anymore. I'm going to fix it because it needs attention. It needs time to fix gender inequality. The administrative burden for companies, I hear. Really? You want to talk business? There is a well-known report in the Netherlands from McKinsey saying that the Dutch economy is losing billions because of the lack of gender equality. Administrative burden while you're losing billions? Come on. The statistics show 13% gender pay gap in Europe. That's the statistics here, and it's significant. What's your solution? Contribute to the solution then. Fix the issue then, because it's still 13% and we're still talking. Now we are really doing something. It's the very first step to close the gender pay gap. And it's a right. It's a European right. It's in our treaties to treat men and women equal. So I don't understand the issue here. And I'm very proud, because this legislation is progressive, it's modern, it's feminist, it's liberal, it's intersectional. So today is a good day. And I'm going to celebrate. I'm going to celebrate because we have true legislation in place from now to give women their right, specifically to be paid on an equal basis. So I'm going to celebrate big time because it's a good day for women in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Raffaella. To conclude the discussion, the rapporteur, Mrs. Peter Hansen.
Again, Samira, for your tireless efforts to fight for women and all kinds of women. And thank you very much, colleagues, for all of your remarks. I'm extremely happy that we are finally voting on this agreement and that we move forward with this important piece of legislation. I envision a future where employees are valued for their work regardless of their gender. A future where employees know their rights and they are not afraid to exercise them because they know that they are protected by European law. The future is here. We have achieved that. And we finally have pay transparency tools to combat pay discrimination, gender income inequalities, and to empower workers. So I look forward to the vote, and I'm going to celebrate as well. And I hope that this whole House is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Peter Hansen. The debate is closed. The vote will be held today after the next dossier. The next point on the agenda, the joint debate concerning rule of law. It concerns a Commission statement on the 2022 Rule of Law report, Rule of Law in Europe, as well as concerning rule of law in Greece, rule of law in Spain, and rule of law in Malta.